Hi, everybody. This is Jim Skelly. This week, we're doing something a little bit different. I'm going to give you a preview of a lecture that I'm giving at a conference in Boston on this coming Wednesday. It's the conference of the Forum on Education Abroad, and I'm talking about some of basically the background theoretical issues that inform this class. So I thought it would be useful to record this lecture for you, and we can discuss it in the future if you have any questions about it. That would be very interesting for me. Let me start by saying that, and I'll just run you right through the lecture, okay? Given my own concerns about the tempestuous world we live in, I'm therefore especially pleased to be with you today because I think the Forum on Education Abroad provides a community of dialogue that can fundamentally inform the emerging global discourse about our common human future. And as I think many of you know, that future is under challenge, as I was reminded by a dark human story I heard in Budapest last spring. Here's the story. Two planets who haven't seen each other for some time meet up in space somewhere near the Crab Nebula, and one says to the other, "It's been a long time. How are you?" After some hesitation, the other planet says, "Well, not so good." "Why? What's the matter?" says the first planet. The other replies after further hesitation and with some embarrassment, "I have Homo sapiens." First planet says, "Oh, don't worry. It doesn't last long." One of the pleasures of working in the field of international education is that we can feel good about our work. We all know that at one level of analysis, we're trying to create a better world. We provide the opportunities for students who, after all, embody the human future, to engage with people in other cultures and therefore create mutual understanding between the peoples of different societies. We think rightly, I would argue, that by doing this we make a modest contribution to a more just and peaceful world, regardless of the field of academic study that we might assist a student to pursue. The problem, of course, is that it's very easy for us to be morally satisfied as well, especially when we, however unconsciously, compare our work with those in the academy and elsewhere who have a more narrow and provincial perspective than we who think in grand global terms. As I've noted in other lectures and articles with regard to a sentiment that some express in the field of peace studies, we know we are the good ones. If only everyone else would see the world as we do, everything would be just fine. Now, such moral satisfaction, however, can unfortunately lead to a diminution in our critical thinking at a time in human history when we need the ability to see our world and human habitation of it as clearly as we possibly can, and to act upon what we see. Our tendency as humans is to work with what we think we know. How can this or that be fixed? What might we do to improve the education abroad experience? How can we enhance the ethical operations of participants' education abroad programs, etc., etc.? All worthy concerns within a limited context. For our ethical concerns to be truly meaningful, however, we must, I would argue, take a much broader view of our work and how we substantively inform it. As we know, the interdependence of humanity has become starkly clear. We cannot pretend to moral innocence in the face of the sufferings of other peoples who may have been affected by hunger, flooding, desertification, or oil spills. As Zygmunt Bauman, the British Polish sociologist, has noted, we cannot declare that we do not know, nor can we be certain that there is nothing we could change in our conduct that would avert or at least alleviate the sufferer's fate. The problem, however, Bauman argues, is that our moral imagination has not progressed much beyond the scope it had acquired in Adam and Eve time, and therefore the responsibilities we are ready to assume do not venture as far as the influence that our daily conduct exerts on the lives of ever more distant people. Thus, rather than an ethics constructed around formal and abstract reasoning, we need a fundamentally different ethical perspective that will provide the foundation for the education of students in a world transformed and attend to the impact that our way of life exerts on the lives of those distant people. Such an ethical perspective should be informed by a sense of responsibility and relationship in which the concrete global context provides the framework for our educational initiatives and other actions. The subtitle of this talk is A Contextual Approach to Ethics in International Education, for a significant reason. I chose this theme because I want to suggest that much of what we occupy ourselves with in the field of international education is currently informed by a decontextualized approach, rather than one that emphasizes a holistic perspective regarding our ethical and other concerns. As a consequence, I don't think that we're preparing students adequately for the world that they will confront in this century, and therefore we're failing to attend to what should be our most fundamental ethical concern, the future of the human species. We're all familiar, I'm sure, with the parable of the blind men who were brought to the palace and asked by the king to describe what sort of thing is an elephant. Depending upon which part of the elephant they touch, each of the men asserts that the elephant is like a pot, a brush, a pillar, etc. None of them are able to grasp the whole, and thus they are unable to conceptualize the full meaning of that which they have encountered. Unfortunately, I think we humans have a similar problem of perception and conceptualization when it comes to thinking about life on this precious blue planet. And this has profound implications for our work as international educators and the way we inform that work with ethical concerns. The problems associated with decontextualized rationality were vividly illustrated in the early 1980s in Carol Gilligan's seminal work, In a Different Voice, in which she contrasted the forms of moral reasoning that men utilized with those of women. Gilligan had wondered why women consistently scored lower on the scale of moral development that Lawrence Kohlberg had elaborated, and found that it was implicitly biased toward the male world. If instead one derived developmental constructs from the moral lives of women, moral problems arose from conflicting responsibilities rather than from competing rights, and required for its resolution a mode of thinking that is contextual and narrative rather than formal and abstract. Such a conception of morality is concerned with the activity of care, and therefore centers moral development around the development of responsibility and relationships, in contrast to a morality constructed around rights, which emphasize separation rather than connection, and the individual rather than the relationship as the primary focus. In the mid-1980s, while I was serving as Associate Director of the University of California's System-Wide Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation, I coordinated an international circle of discourse analytic scholars who focused their research on the discourse of the Cold War and the nuclear arms race. One of those scholars, James Wirch, now at Washington University in St. Louis, applied Gilligan's critique of decontextualized rationality to the work of the nuclear strategist Herman Kahn, the author of Thinking About the Unthinkable, in other words, nuclear war. Kahn, Wirch concluded, had provided the archetypal example of decontextualized rationality in the mode of representation he used in illustrating the consequences of nuclear war. Kahn had famously claimed that between 10 and 60 million deaths in a nuclear war with the Soviet Union would be acceptable to those Americans who would survive. Wirch argued that in a contextualized mode of representation, communicative messages are structured such that speakers and listeners are encouraged to place themselves personally in the context of the consequences of a nuclear war, and that these consequences are made concrete and real in the sense that they encourage listeners to represent them in terms of how they and those around them would personally be affected. In contrast, he argued that a decontextualized mode of representation does just the opposite and deals with the consequences of nuclear war by using abstract, often quantitative representational means for depicting those consequences, thereby allowing listeners to distance themselves from the personally significant emotional aspects of the situation being represented. Among other things, this mode makes it easier to think the unthinkable. As with nuclear war, I think we want to structure communicative messages today so that speakers and listeners are encouraged to place themselves personally in the context wrought by the consequences engendered by the way we now live on the planet. The prospect of nuclear war in the 1980s was such that many of us felt that it was the predominant ethical issue of our time. Today, the premier ethical issue is ensuring that habitation of this planet can continue for humans and all the other species with which we are interdependent. I currently coordinate a course from the University of Ulster called the Global Conversation, which has 75 students studying in or from 17 different countries. The course explores how we're living on the planet, the fact that it is unsustainable, and what we might do about it. We attempt to take a contextual approach to the issues that confront us by connecting the dots and therefore confront the damage being done to humans and other species as well as our planet. Connecting the dots means representing the issues so that students can see how they and others like them throughout the world are affected by our way of organizing life on this planet economically and politically. So it means looking at the full scope of industrial pollution in humanity, the various threats to our food and water supplies, the astounding increase in the Earth's population, and the challenges presented by climate disruption, including the increases in migration as more and more people attempt to escape drought, famine, and worse, as in places like Darfur. Can we continue to use energy in such a profligate manner and support a consumerist lifestyle that generates enormous waste as well as a lack of fundamental satisfaction? Can we throw away enough food every day in the United Kingdom and the United States to feed 1.5 billion people, while 1 billion people on this planet don't get enough to eat? Can we really continue to produce 1 million plastic bags worldwide each and every minute? I know that many people in international education think that cross-cultural learning is our ultimate task, but I beg to differ. I think the ultimate task, and thus the ultimate ethical task, is to educate our students to the conditions that we and others face on this planet. My assessment is that notions of cross-cultural learning and the like have their roots in the cultural anthropology of the 1960s and early 70s, and that, like it or not, the world has fundamentally changed since those days. Globalization and its consequences implies that we must emphasize what humans have in common rather than their distinctions, so that we might create something resembling global consciousness. And this doesn't mean smoking the funny cigarettes some of us smoked in the 1960s. I was doing a quick survey 2 weeks ago of several different types of study abroad programs, all of which had an emphasis on learning about different cultures. One major broker of study abroad programs touts the delights of studying in the port city of Qingdao in China, where you can get great seafood, including shark's fin soup, or whatever your seafood craving is. Another, led by a professor of history and political science at a college in Iowa, informed his students that it was in Hong Kong that he learned to love such exotic delicacies as shark's fin soup, while a professor of international business at a Texas university takes his students on a China business study abroad experience, which is meant, and I quote, to provide the students the opportunity to understand directly the benefits of cross-cultural interactions. Thus, one of his students waxes enthusiastically on their study abroad blog about, quote, sampling exotic foods such as shark fin soup. Even that venerable concern American Field Service, which describes itself as an organization that provides intercultural learning opportunities to help people develop the knowledge, skills, and understanding needed to create a more just and peaceful world, advertises its program in Malaysia by talking about the, quote, range of mouth-watering food on offer, including shark fin soup. Yao Ming, the star of the Houston Rockets basketball team, by way of contrast, knows that more and more species of sharks are endangered and some are facing extinction soon because of the practice of cutting the fins off sharks and throwing them back into the sea, where they die. He has pledged to never eat shark fin soup again. A middle-range estimate is that 10,000 sharks are killed each and every day, including some apparently consumed so that students can better understand another culture. In one of his recent books, Zygmunt Bauman poses the rhetorical question, quote, does ethics have a chance in a world of consumers? Perhaps not, especially if international educators don't change the menus advertised to students in the interest of intercultural learning. More substantively, however, how do we create a broader ethical framework for our work that is in accord with the moral challenges that we confront globally and which can inform the programs we offer to students? To begin, I think we need to understand the world our students are immersed in, and most importantly, the enormous difficulty they face in making meaningful sense of our current condition. Given the overwhelming amount of information and disconnected bits that students are swimming in, that all of us are swimming in, it becomes increasingly difficult for them to develop a coherent sense of what is happening in the actual world rather than in the limited virtual worlds they seem increasingly to inhabit. I sincerely wonder, given the tsunami of information that our students have been subjected to, if we are not seeing the development of a kind of cyber peasantry in which the mind has a mass of bits of information strewn incoherently about in a manner that mimics the images of the devastation that followed the recent horrific tsunami in Japan. The explosion of information has occurred since World War II, and like the Japanese tsunamis, seems to grow ever larger. A recent study conducted at the University of Southern California indicated that using digital and analog devices, we are now able to store 295 exabytes. Put 20 zeros after the 295. 295 exabytes of information, which is 315 times the numbers of grains of sand in the world. According to Science Daily, humans successfully sent 1.9 zettabytes of information in 2007 through broadcast technology such as television and GPS units. Zettabytes have 21 zeros. That's equivalent to every person in the world reading 174 newspapers every day. The problem for those of us concerned with ethics, as the information theorists will proudly tell you, is that information is independent of meaning. Because as Freeman Dyson recently pointed out in the New York Review of Books, quote, information could be handled with greater freedom if it was treated as a mathematical abstraction, independent of meaning. In other words, decontextualized rationality taken to its logical conclusion. Dyson suggests that it is the immense size of modern databases that give us a feeling of meaninglessness, but that it is our task as humans to bring meaning back into this wasteland. This is reflected, as Jürgen Habermas has noted, by the fact that the political culture of a world society lacks the common ethical political dimension that would be necessary for a corresponding global community. To quote Carol Gilligan again, we can only bring meaning back to our work by encouraging a mode of thought that is contextual and narrative rather than formal and abstract. In the book Imagined Communities, Benedict Anderson's work that detailed the development of the imagined community of the nation, we may find some insight and direction, because what we need today is a global imagined community. 40 years ago, during the proceedings that led to my lawsuit against the United States Secretary of Defense, I claimed conscientious objection rather than kill Vietnamese. I cited the French theologian and paleontologist Teilhard de Chardin. Teilhard had argued that the, quote, and I really would like you to pay attention to this, the age of nations is past. The task before us now, if we would not perish, is to build the earth, end quote. This is, I think, our ultimate ethical task, building the earth, and that requires the elimination of individualist and racial heresies, because no evolutionary future awaits humans except in association with all other humans. Zygmunt Bauman reminds us that there are no local solutions to globally rooted problems. The causes of survival and justice now point in the same direction, call for similar strategies, and tend to converge into one. And that unified cause cannot be pursued, let alone fulfilled, locally and by local-only efforts. Global problems have only global solutions, and on a globalizing planet, human problems can be tackled and resolved only through human solidarity. That solidarity and our ethical task is best expressed in some excerpts from the commencement address that the environmentalist and writer Paul Hawken gave to the graduating class at the University of Portland just under 2 years ago. Hawken said the following to the students. Basically, civilization needs a new operating system. You are the programmers, and we need it within a few decades. This planet came with a set of instructions, but we seem to have misplaced them. Important rules like don't poison the water, soil, or air. Don't let the earth get overcrowded, and don't touch the thermostat have been broken. And here's the deal. Forget that this task of planet saving is not possible in the time required. Don't be put off by people who know what is not possible. Do what needs to be done and check to see if it was impossible only after you are done. When asked if I am pessimistic or optimistic about the future, my answer is always the same. If you look at the science about what is happening on Earth and aren't pessimistic, you don't understand the data. But if you meet the people who are working to restore this earth and the lives of the poor, and you aren't optimistic, you haven't got a pulse. What I see everywhere in the world are ordinary people willing to confront despair, power, and incalculable odds in order to restore some semblance of grace, justice, and beauty to this world. The poet Adrienne Rich wrote, "So much has been destroyed. I have cast my lot with those who, age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world." There could be no better description. Humanity is coalescing. It is reconstituting the world, and the action is taking place in schoolrooms, farms, jungles, villages, campuses, companies, refugee camps, deserts, fisheries, and slums. And I would also hope in the Forum on Education Abroad as well. Thanks very much. So that's it for this week, my colleagues in the Global Conversation. I'll be in touch. I'll send you a copy of this in written form. I hope the learning circles are coming along. I'll have some more information for you later this week. All the best.